Comparing the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. The Vietnam War and the Iraq War were among the most controversial wars in American history. They were pretty recent too, especially the Iraq War, having ended only in 2011. Most of us were already born at that time. The two wars had many similarities, but also many little aspects in contrast. What was the Vietnam War? Most Americans will say it was a fight for democracy or for freedom. Some might say it was America's struggle to defend the world from communism. And they would be right either way, especially with the word struggle, because to be quite honest, that was pretty much all America was able to achieve, a struggle. Technically, the Vietnam War started way earlier than 1955. It began right after the Second World War, when the French tried, but failed, to recolonize Vietnam. America had been supplying the French with millions of dollars worth of financial aid and military supplies. It was only after the French left that America began to grow more and more involved. America's cause for involvement changed from the original purpose of trying to maintain good relations with the French to America's own unwavering determination in containing communism. After the French left, Vietnam was torn by two opposing governments. In the north was Ho Chi Minh, the communist revolutionary leader. In the south was Ngo Dinh Diem, the last prime minister of the state of Vietnam, and his completely corrupt government. Diem's popularity had been plummeting lower and lower with his ruthless suppression of all opposition, his reluctance to distribute land to peasants, and his restriction of Buddhist practices. Compared to Diem's corruptness, Ho looked like a much better leader for Vietnam. Ho's communist ideologies appealed strongly to the people of Vietnam, as it would have promoted equality and equal land distribution to all people. Their large difference in popularity should have been a bright red flag for the American government when it was deciding whether or not to support Diem's regime. Throughout the years, America sent more and more soldiers overseas to fight in the name of suppressing communism and bringing democracy to Asia. But in doing so, were we really taking into account what most of the people in Vietnam wanted? Was sending millions of dollars to a government already plagued with corruptness and incompetence a necessary action for the US to have taken on the opposite side of the world? The Iraq War. In 2003, the Iraq War began and lasted all the way until 2011. Politically, the US claimed that Iraq was in close relations with Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group from 9/11, and that the invasion of Iraq would be part of the War on Terror, an American military campaign still going to this date in the name of fighting terrorism. However, this claim was quickly undermined due to a lack of evidence. The government also claimed that Iraq housed weapons of mass destruction, so the United Nations sent a commission of people over to inspect. However, for some mysterious reason, maybe because they were having their military supplies inspected on the basis of a mere assumption, the Iraqi government was not very cooperative with the inspections and interfered repeatedly. Iraq's refusal to cooperate with the UN frustrated the international community, and in 1998, it became Bill Clinton's excuse to execute Operation Desert Fox, a bombing of multiple military installations in Iraq. However, the bombing only made Iraq more reluctant to cooperate, and they rejected UN representatives from entering the country altogether. It was later officially confirmed that Iraq never had any weapons of mass destruction in the first place. Apart from the weak claims of relations with terrorist groups and non-existent weapons of mass destruction, one actually legitimate cause for the invasion was the overthrow of the Iraqi president, Saddam Hussein. Hussein was a dictator. During his time in power, he brought about the deaths of at least 250,000 Iraqis and committed war crimes in Iran, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. The coalition forces were able to capture Hussein after a few months of the invasion, only to find a man hiding in a hole. Further interrogations and trials confirmed that Iraq was not supplying Al-Qaeda with weapons, nor did Iraq have any weapons of mass destruction in the first place. Despite the government's stated reasons for invading these countries, some underlying factors might have exerted a greater influence on the government's decision-making. The invasion of Vietnam could have been motivated by the objective of safeguarding American interests in the region. Vietnam possessed valuable natural resources such as rubber, tin, and minerals, which the US sought to retain access to. Additionally, it is plausible that the US desired increased economic influence in Asia, which would provide a larger market for selling goods. Similarly, in Iraq, the US probably had reasons for its invasion that it didn't publicly talk about. It's no secret that the Middle East houses huge oil reserves and is the world's largest region of production and exportation. One significant motive for the US's invasion of Iraq could have been to establish American influence in the Middle East, so as to ensure a stable and affordable supply chain of oil for the US.
Both the Vietnam War and the Iraq War were extremely different in the style of fighting that occurred. In the Vietnam War, there were small skirmishes and scouting missions, as well as a lot of bombing. However, there weren't many major land invasions or occupations, at least not within the enemy-controlled north half of Vietnam. On the other hand, in Iraq, there was more of a focus on taking and holding objectives rather than just damaging the enemy's morale and resources. As such, this meant that the Iraq War dragged on for much longer. It also meant that more resources had to be focused more densely in Iraq. This led to a lot of waiting and not nearly as much action, but it also meant that United States soldiers were at less of a risk of dying and felt safer and could therefore do their duties more effectively. However, it is also important to note that unlike in Vietnam, where the enemy was everywhere, in Iraq, the enemy was very hard to find. In Vietnam, United States soldiers often found themselves trying not to be found by the North Vietnamese army. In Iraq, they often found themselves searching for insurgents that they couldn't find. With that being said, I'm going to start by looking at and analyzing a mission that was done in North Vietnam by the United States military, in which they attempted to free multiple prisoners of war from an unauthorized prisoner of war camp known as the Son Tay prison camp. The raid was known as the Son Tay prison raid or Operation Ivory Coast. This is a battle plan map that I made of the Son Tay raid, also known as Operation Ivory Coast. Operation Ivory Coast was a mission undergone by United States Marine Corps members during the Vietnam War. It struck near the heart of North Korea in the Son Tay region, which is quite near the capital. This was a prisoner of war camp from which they were attempting to free all of the prisoners. It was located very closely to one of the largest North Vietnamese prisoner of war camps, known to the Americans as the Hanoi Hilton. However, this one had not been disclosed to the Americans and was not made known during peace talks. As such, prisoners who were sent there were very unlikely to ever be returned, and prison trades and releases were all but impossible. As such, at facilities like these secret POW camps, these secret POW camps would be considered unauthorized and violations of laws regarding warfare and such. So the United States decided to go in and get their soldiers out. As you can see from the drawing here, the facility was not that large. It consisted of some outer fences denoted by the single X's in a row. All these fences had towers on either end of them, denoted as the triangles with a dot in the center. The two areas marked LZ are landing zones. This is where American Marine Corps troops crashed helicopters intentionally into the compound in order to get there immediately and not have to walk from a faraway landing zone. Now, as you can see, there are two parts, if you will, to the facility. There is one that is within a wall. This is marked by the sort of square squiggly line, as well as the X's in a row with a line through them, and the other tower there, which is a curved triangle with a dot in it. Within here, there was one main facility, as well as one of the landing zones in which they crashed the chopper in. Outside of that, behind a general fence, which is marked by the X's with the line through it, that are more spread out X's, there were 3 to 4 buildings. It's not clear how connected the buildings were from some of the maps I'm looking at, and it sort of changed over time because it was quite hastily put together. The site marked with a person behind jail bars is the portion of the camp that was used to house prisoners. The plans were for the 2 landing zone teams to converge in the center of the courtyard area near the 3 other targets, and then move to the position of the prisoners of war, remove them, and get them to an evac point. Unfortunately, while the raid went really well, they cut the towers, the guard towers, quite literally in half with machine guns, just destroying the support structures and causing them to fall over, and bombed the entire place to bits. Unfortunately, they were unable to bomb any buildings because they couldn't be sure which buildings did or didn't have prisoners in them, so they had to bomb outside of the buildings. However, that was still effective in dealing with most of the enemy combatants. When they got to the place where the prisoners were supposed to be, they found the facility empty. So, while the raid was militarily a huge success, unfortunately it had been burned. Basically, during the planning phases, which lasted quite a while, anti-war sympathizers within the government decided to take matters into their own hands and alert the Russians and Vietnamese of what was going to happen. As such, they were prepared, and they evacuated all of the prisoners. They also planned to set up an ambush to trap the Americans. However, the American mission went out a bit earlier than expected. So when they got there, although the prisoners had already been evacuated, the ambush was not fully set up yet. However, that is an intelligence failure, not a military failure, and that failure occurred on the other side of the pond in America. From a strategy point of view, as far as what was executed, in order to, from the moment the helicopters left the aircraft carriers or whatever base they came from and came to Song Tay, from that point forward, this mission was, in almost every aspect, perfect. It also describes and defines the Vietnam War and American war doctrine within the Vietnam War very well. The Americans would use small insurgent teams to try to strike deep into the hearts of the enemies. With that being said, I'm now going to talk about the Iraq War and American military doctrine in the Iraq War. As for the Iraq War, many troops were sent in the ground invasion of Iraq shortly after an intense bombing raid known as shock and awe. The idea was to quite literally scare the Iraqis into surrendering and capitulating to the American demands. It was quite successful. Many Iraqi soldiers were surrendering before the Americans had even crossed the border from Kuwait into Iraq. There was really only one region where there was serious resistance to the American invasion, and that's in the Nahdz region. However, all over Iraq, soldiers found themselves having to play the part of mediator and more or less local law enforcement, as they had to deal with squabbles between locals, old petty rivalries that blew out of proportion, especially because the government had been replaced and was changing, access to weapons was greater than ever, and tensions between the two main religious groups in the area were extremely high. As such, there was a lot of small-scale fighting, not necessarily regarding any political groups, but just fighting amongst citizenry, and most of what the American soldiers had to deal with was this. With that in mind, this meant that the American military doctrine in Iraq was more of that of a law enforcement doctrine, in that their job was to secure the scene, investigate what happened, and find a solution to the problem. This is very different than what happened in Vietnam. In Vietnam, they were fighting a war, more or less. In Iraq, they had already finished the war actually not within minutes, but the moment they crossed the border, the war was over, more or less. They hadn't found Saddam Hussein, but there was no military resistance, so to speak, outside of the Nas region. As such, they did the job of de facto law enforcement in the area. This meant that they could take things at their own pace, and meant that militarily it was a much safer operation with much better success rates. As a matter of fact, the worst day in the Iraq War, casualties-wise, had a casualty rate of 10 soldiers that day. And this was in the Nas region. If you compare that to Vietnam, where hundreds of soldiers have died in single days, you can see the large difference. So, in conclusion, while the Vietnam War was very much small insurgent groups of American specialized troops trying to achieve big goals through single, deeply penetrating operations, the Iraq War was more of a blanket trying to cover the flames of the United States enemy. As such, this meant that one was small, dangerous missions in, that being Vietnam, and the other was a long, slow, but quite safe sort of push and wave through Iraq.
Both wars were met with opposition in the United States. During the Vietnam War, drafts were somewhat biased, drawing mainly from minorities or middle to lower class white people. The unfair drafting system caused a lot of student opposition toward the war. Additionally, some Americans believed that the proclaimed communist threat was just an excuse for the government to hide its imperialistic intentions in Asia. Others argued that the Vietnam War was a civil war, and America's intervention interfered with the self-determination of the country. Also, the Vietnam War was America's first war to feature extensive television coverage. People could watch American soldiers fighting in the jungles of Vietnam straight from televisions at home. However, the convenience of being able to watch young men die in the other hemisphere of the world only increased opposition against the war. Media coverage contradicted the government's optimistic claims of winning a quick and easy war, and made it very clear to Americans that they were fighting for an already lost cause. As the years progressed, opposition grew stronger and stronger, until the US finally declared the end in 1973. Before the Iraq War began, the majority of people from different countries around the world, and the United Nations itself, opposed the US's plan to invade Iraq. There simply was not enough basis for invasion, and other critics claimed that it would cause the deaths of thousands of both Iraqi civilians and soldiers, as well as coalition forces. Despite this, the US still formed a coalition of the willing and declared war on Iraq. Following the invasion, the coalition forces found no weapons of mass destruction, nor any substantial evidence of links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. Protests against the US invasion of Iraq were held all over the world, with the biggest rallies in Europe. Back in America in 2005, 2 years into the war, opposers of the war had already outnumbered supporters, claiming the majority. The movement was one of the largest global peace protests since the Vietnam War. After trials and interrogations, Saddam Hussein was executed in 2006 for his war crimes, but the Iraq War dragged on until 2011, when President Obama withdrew all American forces. The Vietnam War and Iraq War had many aspects in common, but also had some differences. Both wars had very weak foundations and hence developed a lot of controversies, with public support declining year after year as the war dragged on.